37 years later, and somehow it still hasn't let go. There are movies you watch once and forget. And then there are movies that stay with you, long after the credits roll, long after the music fades, long after the final scene. Dirty Dancing is one of those movies. It didn't just entertain people, it became a feeling, a memory, a moment in time that millions keep coming back to. But what if everything you thought you knew about this iconic film wasn't the full story? What if the movie that defined a generation almost never made it to the screen at all? Because behind the romance, behind the music, behind that unforgettable final dance, there was chaos. There were doubts. There were decisions so risky, so controversial, that at multiple points, the entire project was on the verge of being shut down completely. And even more surprising, some of the most important moments in the film, the ones audiences still talk about today, were never supposed to happen. This isn't just a story about a movie. This is the story of everything that nearly destroyed it and everything that accidentally made it legendary. The title that nearly killed the film. Before Dirty Dancing became a cultural phenomenon, it had a problem. A big one. The title. Today, the name feels iconic, instantly recognizable, almost untouchable. But back in the late 1980s, it was anything but safe. In fact, it was considered risky, inappropriate, even scandalous. At a time when Hollywood was still carefully navigating public opinion, words mattered, titles mattered, and Dirty Dancing, that wasn't just edgy, it was dangerous. Studios were nervous, producers were hesitant, and censorship boards, they didn't just raise eyebrows, they raised alarms. There were genuine concerns that audiences would misunderstand the film entirely, that they'd assume it was something explicit, something inappropriate, something that wouldn't be allowed in theaters at all. And those fears weren't just theoretical. At one point, film materials were reportedly held at the Canadian border because officials believed it might be an X-rated production. Think about that for a second. A film that would go on to become one of the most beloved romantic movies of all time was nearly blocked before anyone even saw it, all because of a title. And yet what makes this even more unbelievable is that not everyone involved in the film even liked the name to begin with, especially not its leading man. Patrick Swayze wasn't shy about how he felt. In interviews, he openly admitted that he hated the title. To him, it didn't reflect the heart of the story. It didn't capture the emotion, the transformation, the depth of the characters. He thought it reduced something meaningful into something cheap. And he wasn't alone. Behind closed doors, there were discussions about changing it entirely, about rebranding the film into something more acceptable, something safer. At one point, an alternative title was even floated. I Was a Teenage Mambo Queen. It sounds almost unbelievable now, almost absurd. And maybe that's exactly why it never stuck. Because despite all the resistance, despite all the fear, the original title remained. And in hindsight, it may have been the very thing that made people curious enough to watch it in the first place. But the title controversy was only the beginning. Because if you think that was the biggest risk the film took, you haven't heard anything yet. The casting choices that could have changed everything. It's hard to imagine Dirty Dancing without its two stars. Their chemistry, their tension, their connection. It felt real, effortless, like it was always meant to be. But here's the truth. It almost didn't happen. The role of Johnny Castle, the quiet, intense dance instructor who would become one of the most iconic romantic leads in film history, was far from guaranteed. In fact, several other actors were seriously considered before the final decision was made. Names that at the time were either rising stars or on the verge of becoming household names. Actors like Billy Zane, Benicio del Toro, and even Val Kilmer. Each of them brought something different to the table. A different energy, a different interpretation of the character. And if any one of them had been cast instead, the entire tone of the film could have shifted. Because Johnny Castle wasn't just a role. He was the emotional core of the story. The contrast to Baby's innocence. The quiet force that drove her transformation. Get that wrong, and the whole movie falls apart. So, why wasn't the decision easy? Why wasn't Patrick Swayze an immediate yes? Ironically, because of his past, he was already known for dancing, highly trained, skilled, experienced. In fact, he had studied at prestigious institutions like the Harkness and Joffrey Ballet Schools, which should have made him the perfect choice. But in Hollywood, things aren't always that simple. Sometimes being too perfect for a role can work against you. There were concerns that audiences wouldn't see Johnny Castle as a raw, struggling dance instructor, but instead as a polished performer. Someone too refined, too controlled. And then there was another issue, chemistry. Because casting Johnny wasn't just about finding the right actor. It was about finding someone who could connect, truly connect, with Baby, and that brought its own set of complications. A chemistry that wasn't supposed to work. On screen, their connection feels electric, natural, intense, unforgettable. But behind the scenes, it wasn't always that way. Jennifer Grey and Patrick Swayze had worked together before, and their previous experience hadn't exactly been smooth. There were tensions, disagreements, moments where their personalities simply didn't align. And when they were brought together again for Dirty Dancing, those old dynamics, in fact, they resurfaced. There were reports of frustration during rehearsals, of differing approaches to scenes, of emotional moments that felt just a little too real, and yet something unexpected happened. Instead of destroying the film, that tension became part of it. It added layers, depth, authenticity, because the story itself wasn't about a perfect relationship. It was about two people from completely different worlds trying to understand each other, struggling, clashing, growing. And in a strange way, the actors' real-life dynamic mirrored that journey, which raises an interesting question. Would the film have worked as well if everything had been easy? If there had been no friction, no conflict, no emotional edge? Or was it that very imperfection that made the story feel so real? The real story behind the script. While audiences fell in love with the characters, many didn't realize just how personal the story actually was. Because Dirty Dancing wasn't just fiction. It was inspired by real life. Eleanor Bergstein didn't just write a script. She recreated pieces of her own past, her experiences, her memories, even her nickname. Baby wasn't just a character. It was something she had been called herself. And the world of summer resorts, dance competitions, and quiet coming-of-age moments, those weren't imagined. They were lived, which explains something important. Why the story feels so grounded, even in its most dramatic moments. Why the characters don't feel like stereotypes, but like real people. Why the emotional beats land with such authenticity. Because they came from somewhere real, but that authenticity also created challenges. Studios weren't always convinced that audiences would connect with such a personal, specific story. They worried it was too niche, too different, too risky. And for a long time, those doubts almost won. The scenes you never noticed. Even if you've watched Dirty Dancing dozens of times, there are things you probably missed. Small details, unscripted moments, tiny imperfections that somehow made it into the final cut. And here's the surprising part. Some of the most iconic scenes weren't planned at all. They weren't carefully choreographed or meticulously rehearsed. They happened by accident. Take the famous rehearsal scenes, for example. Moments where the characters laugh, struggle, missteps. Those weren't always acting. Sometimes they were real, genuine reactions that felt too authentic to remove. Moments where the line between performance and reality blurred. And instead of cutting them out, the filmmakers leaned into them. Because they realized something powerful. Perfection isn't always what audiences connect with. Sometimes it's the flaws, the awkwardness, the humanity. That's what makes something feel real. And in a film built around transformation, those imperfect moments became essential. The risk that paid off. By the time Dirty Dancing was finally ready for release, expectations were uncertain. It wasn't a guaranteed success. It wasn't backed by overwhelming confidence. If anything, it was the opposite. There were doubts about the story, concerns about the title, questions about the cast, and a lingering fear that audiences simply wouldn't show up. But then something unexpected happened. They did, not just in small numbers, not just for a brief moment, but in waves. The film didn't just succeed, it exploded. It connected. It resonated. It became something bigger than anyone had predicted. And suddenly all those risks, all those decisions that almost destroyed the project, they became the very reasons it worked. Why? It still matters today. Decades later, Dirty Dancing still holds its place, not just as a movie, but as a cultural moment, a reminder of a time when stories didn't need to be perfect to be powerful, when risks weren't avoided but embraced, when imperfections weren't hidden but celebrated. And maybe that's why it continues to resonate, because at its core, it's not just about dance, or romance, or nostalgia. It's about change, about stepping outside of expectations, about finding your voice even when the world tells you not to. And in that sense, the story behind the film might be just as meaningful as the story on screen. The truth behind the legacy. Looking back now, it's easy to see Dirty Dancing as inevitable, as if it was always destined to succeed. But the truth is far more complicated. It almost didn't happen. It almost fell apart. It almost became just another forgotten project. And yet, against all odds, it didn't. Because sometimes the stories that struggle the most to be told are the ones that matter the most.